So we covered the basic semantic elements. Now let's look at the elements we use for structuring web pages. Pretty much most web pages have at least 3 building blocks: a header, the main content, and a footer. That's a pretty common structure. Now sometimes we can have a sidebar for advertising or other content that is not directly related to the main content. So after the main element, we can have an aside element. Now in the header, quite often we have a navigation bar with a list of menu items. What element do we use to represent this list? We talked about this before. We use an unordered list. So here we can have an unordered list with a bunch of list items, okay? Now similarly, in the footer, we can have another navigation element with an unordered list. So we can have multiple navigation elements on the same page. Now, sometimes in the main area, we may have multiple sections. For example, we may have a section for showcasing the top products we're selling and another section for the testimonials. So with the section element, we can group related content. Now, every section should have a heading, which is quite often an H2, but that really depends on where we are in the hierarchy of our headings. So here we can say products. So if we don't supply this heading and validate our web page, we'll get a validation error. Now let's say here we're going to represent the top selling products. What element can we use to represent each product? We talked about this in the previous lesson. We can use an article. With the article element, we can represent any independent, self-contained piece of content. So here we might have multiple article elements. Similarly, in the testimonial section, we may have a heading and a bunch of articles. Once again, we can represent each testimonial using an article. Now, I want to clarify something. Don't assume that this is the only way to structure a web page. This is just an example so you can see the purpose of these semantic container elements. How you use them to structure your web pages really depends on what you have on those pages. For example, here we have multiple articles inside a section, but we can also have multiple sections inside an article. For example, imagine this article is representing a blog post or a newspaper article. Here we can have multiple sections. That's a perfectly valid structure. Also, the header and footer elements don't just represent the header and the footer of the page. We may use them inside a section or an article. Again, it really depends on what we're representing. So let's quickly recap. We use the main element to represent the main content of the page. And that means every page can have only one main element. If we use more than one main element and validate our web page, we'll get a validation error. We use the section element to group related content. We use the header element to represent introductory content, which can belong to the page or a section or an article. The footer element can be used in the same way. And finally, we use the aside element for representing content not directly related to the main content.